Notice second point, that there's an end to state economic support demanded. It is vital to understand that the process of Islamization is largely funded by Islamic states. Islamic states who may overtly reject violence and even issue vehement statements against terrorism. Some of the most vehement website rhetoric I've heard against the state of Iran comes out of Saudi Arabia. Well, they hate them. And they hate them. Nevertheless, contrary to the philosophy of pragmatism and objections I've heard, I do not hold that these are separate and distinct movements, and that one side can be defeated without defeating the other. This is not true. The Saudi state is, of course, in many ways more deeply fundamentalist than Iran. We can note, for example, that Iran has a political constitution. In Khomeini's revolution, the first thing he did was write a constitution. The Saudis have been promised a constitution for 70 years now, but they don't need one by their ideology because the Quran is the constitution. These are two aspects of the same movement with the same goals. It is vital to make that integration and not to fall for the sectarian differences within. Two different methods of obtaining the same thing. So it is vital for us to declare that there will be an end to state economic support for Islam. This is going to require a challenge to one of the 5 pillars of Islam, which is alms. It's going to require us to demand that charity become truly private charity. That means that it not be taken by enforced taxation or as a duty imposed upon Muslims, but from voluntary means. And then the other side of that is that it not be used to promote the spread of state Islam through Islamization. So there's this economic aspect. And we should note that funding of propaganda is not charity. A third point, first being to note that this is not a demand for change in beliefs, but in the right to oppose them. The second being a demand for an end to economic support. The third relates to education. I do not see how this threat can be eliminated from the world as long as thousands of schools are continuing to inculcate jihad in young people. To end militaristic teaching in Japan was one of the central goals of the Supreme Commander, and something which was taken on as a central tenet of the occupation. The results were magnificent. We know of a girls' school in Japan where the girls stood up and demanded the removal of their principal because he continued to teach militarism. We know of another school where students went on strike and demanded the removal of a teacher for teaching militarism. He stood in front of the assembly of the school with tears in his eyes, renouncing his past errors and pledging himself to correct this error. And that was the end of militaristic teaching in those schools. It is vital for us to recognize this and not to evade this fact, that there are hundreds of thousands and perhaps millions of people coming through such an educational system, deeply imbued with the ideas of jihad, knowing no other worldview, and therefore committed to die for it. And a fourth point here is we must demand an end for state support for religious beliefs and rituals. And recognize that when I talk about state support here, it's not only the direct imposition of these by governments over a specific territory, but the inculcation of these beliefs and rituals through Islamization and through covert propaganda. Now, these are the tenets I think that would be required for a proper policy. To identify the threat, to name it, to recognize its various means of being established, and to pledging ourselves to end them. Now, identifying the enemy as Islamic totalitarianism or state Islam will have multiple benefits. It will allow us to defeat the states where Islamic law has been imposed. Taking this down to a military strategic level, I do not see how this threat could be eliminated as long as the Islamic State of Iran is allowed to exist. Even for its enemies within Islam, it is a point of focus for the success of the Islamic Revolution. It is impossible to declare that we will not allow State Islam to develop elsewhere as long as it is allowed to exist here. Another benefit will be to empower states who face such threats from within to defeat them internally. There will be a lesson in the world. We will remove a certain calculus among the leaders of some nations who have to make a decision. What is worse, to try and confront Islamist movements within our own nation in order to gain the favor of Western nations, or to allow those threats to grow from within and face the possible wrath of the Western nation? We have to remove that calculation. You have to make the consequences of supporting State Islam within so horrific as no calculation is possible. And that will require, I think, an example in the world. We have to force states supporting Islamic totalitarianism to make a choice. I was greatly hoping after 9/11 that when President Bush said, nations must decide, that he meant it and would enforce it, but he did not, and he has not. We have to end, getting a little more localized here, the unconscionable thought of a Palestinian state. How in the world can we possibly declare ourselves to the defeat of State Islam if we allow a new Islamic state to be put in place? And by the way, it is completely irrelevant to me as to whether the leaders of Hamas really believe this deeply or are using it for pragmatic reasons. It's irrelevant to me. As long as Iran is allowed to exist, and should a Palestinian state be allowed to be created, there will be no coherent policy against this threat, and we will not defeat it. We also have to show 1 billion Muslims that it is possible, and indeed beneficial, indeed required, to reject State Islam, and therefore to prosper in their private beliefs. So the motto I bring to you is to identify, the identification I bring to you is to identify this threat as Islamic totalitarianism or State Islam, and perhaps to adopt the motto, State Islam must go. Again, I'm deeply honored for being here. Thank you very much for coming and for the invitation.
Professor Lewis identified 3 ways in which the West blames itself for the conflict: via pragmatism, multicultural